The neon tube above the zinc-lined preparation table gave a long, rattling buzz before spitting a sickly, greenish flicker across the damp concrete floor of the basement. I wiped a smear of sweat and industrial disinfectant from my forehead with the back of a greasy forearm, leaving a streak of gray ash right above my eyebrow. My name is Arthur. Tell me, have you ever spent a rainy Friday night locked deep beneath the freezing asphalt of Manhattan, working the graveyard shift in the basement of a sprawling, overcrowded funeral home where the primary currency of existence is cold steel, heavy pine crates, and dead weight? Most people think death is a quiet, orderly affair. They imagine solemn chapels, hushed organ music, fresh-cut lilies, and grieving families shedding dignified tears into silk handkerchiefs while a polished mahogany casket descends smoothly into the green lawn of a peaceful cemetery. They do not know what it is like down here in the belly of the mortuary, 50 feet below the rumble of subway lines and screeching taxi tires, where the air tastes permanently of raw formalin, stale sweat, and decaying flesh. They do not know about the heavy, suffocating silence that creeps between the stacked shipping crates when the electric generator out back stutters and the old analog equipment begins to creak in the dark. Have you ever asked yourself why a young man with calloused palms and a burnt-out life would willingly spend his nights hauling human remains across a concrete floor, driving 6-inch iron nails into wooden shipping boxes with a heavy mallet? Let me tell you. It is not because of the meager wages paid by the syndicate, which barely cover a bowl of greasy chili and a stale pack of Lucky Strikes at the diner down on 10th Avenue. It is because when you are trying to outrun your own quiet regrets and a history that weighs heavier than any zinc-lined coffin, a cold, windowless basement where nobody can find you feels like the exact place where your failures finally stop chasing you. At least, they do until the clock ticks past midnight and the cargo manifests start piling up faster than your hands can nail the lids shut. Tonight was my final stretch before the weekend transport train was scheduled to back up to the freight chute on 34th Street. An endless labyrinth of towering wooden shipping crates, heavy iron scales, and galvanized steel drums filled the subterranean room on every side, smelling of damp sawdust and sharp chemical preservatives. My job was entirely manual, heavy, and monotonous. Receive the fresh corpses hauled in from Bellevue and city hospitals in the back of rusted municipal vans. Perform the initial drainage and formalin wash on the stainless steel table. Weigh the bodies on the ancient, rusted counterweight scale near the east wall. And hammer the lids shut with thick iron spikes before stamping the shipping tags with black grease ink that took hours to dry on cheap paper. My knuckles were stained permanent black from the stamping pads, the rough pine board slick with a mixture of melted embalming wax and cold condensation as I planted my heavy work boots onto the damp floor and reached out to drag another empty shipping box into place. The rain hammered hard against the street-level iron grates high above our heads, sending long, shivering trickles of dirty water down the mortar walls, while the old radiator by the door hissed like a dying copperhead. I struck a wooden match against the side of the zinc table, brought the flame to the twisted wick of a brass kerosene lamp just in case the failing neon finally blew, and listened to the distant, rhythmic rumble of the midnight subway shaking the foundations beneath my feet. And then, right through the muffled roar of the city traffic above, a heavy municipal delivery van backed hard against the loading ramp, and the iron hydraulic lift groaned as it dropped the first heavy load of the night. The heavy hydraulic lift gave a sharp, metallic screech as it lowered the steel gurney down through the freight doors, and the cold draft of the Manhattan rain swept across the basement floor, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and stale cigarette smoke. Two municipal orderlies in grease-stained gray coats shoved the rubber-wheeled stretcher across the concrete, their boots clacking against the damp floor before they dumped the signed municipal release forms onto the edge of my desk without a single word. They did not stay. They never stayed. They backed their van out into the slick New York night, leaving me alone with the cargo, the buzzing neon tube, and the heavy, suffocating smell of formalin. Have you ever experienced that sudden, icy drop in the pit of your stomach when you pull back a stained canvas sheet and realize the body waiting for you doesn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of the city? People always talk about the dead as if they are fragile, broken things, quiet, peaceful, and completely emptied of power. They imagine gray-haired grandfathers, quiet hospital patients, or accident victims whose struggles ended the moment their heart stopped beating. They expect stillness. They do not know the terrifying, unnatural density of a corpse that feels less like a resting human and more like an iron anvil wrapped in wet canvas. They do not know what it feels like when your back muscles strain, your breath catches in your throat, and every fiber of your being tells you that lifting this specific weight is a mistake you will never be able to undo. I stepped up to the stainless steel table, wiping my palms on my rubber apron, and gripped the edge of the heavy canvas shroud. My boots sank slightly into the wet concrete where the drainage trough had backed up with gray water. I pulled the canvas back in one sharp motion. The man lying beneath the light was massive, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and towering over 6.5 feet long, with skin the color of curdled milk and a bloated chest that looked as though it had been crushed under the wheels of a steamroller. His clothes were soaked through with dark, stagnant river water that pooled sluggishly in the shallow basin of the table, mixing with the chemical runoff from the drain. There was no identification in his pockets. Only a heavy brass pocket watch frozen at 3:14, and a folded piece of cheap newspaper soaked into pulp against his ribs. Think about how much confidence we place in our physical strength, believing that because we can lift 50-pound crates of pine and hammer iron nails into wood, we are in command of our surroundings. We push our bodies through 12-hour shifts in the dark, hauling the city's discarded weight from one zip code to another, convinced that our muscle and grit make us masters of the basement. We tally our numbers in our logbooks and assume that once a body is washed, drained, and boxed up, its story is finished. Then a massive, unidentified stranger is hauled across your threshold in the middle of a rainy Friday night, and you realize that some burdens are too heavy for any man to lift alone. I hooked my hands beneath the dead man's thick shoulders, planting my heavy boots firmly against the concrete and locking my spine for the heave. My muscles tightened. My breath hitched in my chest as I pulled upward, trying to swing his dead weight off the zinc table and into the open pine shipping box waiting beside me. The flesh beneath my palms felt wrong, not soft and yielding like the hundreds of others I had handled during my months in the basement, but tight, frozen, and strangely resilient, like cured leather stretched over iron bars. And then, right as my arms strained against the massive dead weight, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the subterranean room. Crack, snap. It was not the sound of the table bending under the load. It sounded precisely like dry timber snapping inside a vise, coming directly from the center of the dead man's crushed ribcage. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of the room and the steady pulse of life keeping the shadows back. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if you tried to lift a heavy stranger off a cold table and heard his chest bones break apart beneath your grip? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. I froze instantly, my arms locked around the bloated torso, as the dead man's jaw slowly unhinged in the flickering green light of the neon tube. The sharp, echoing snap of splitting bone died away into the damp concrete walls of the basement, leaving behind a silence so absolute that even the distant, rhythmic rumble of the midnight subway seemed to fade into nothingness. My arms remained locked around the massive, waterlogged torso of the stranger. The air in the subterranean room turned instantly bitter, smelling of old river silt and freezing brine that burned the lining of my nose. Have you ever experienced that paralyzing moment of absolute terror when a dead body stops cooperating with the laws of physics and reclaims its own agency right in your hands? People always talk about death as a permanent boundary, a solid wall where the story of a human life stops cold, leaving behind an inert, powerless vessel that can be washed, dressed, and nailed into a box without resistance. They imagine that once a man's heart gives out, his limbs belong entirely to the living who handle them. They do not know the soul-crushing horror of feeling a corpse tense beneath your palms, reacting to your touch as if it were merely sleeping through an inconvenience. They do not know what it feels like when your muscles turn to lead and every instinct you possess screams that you are no longer holding a corpse, but an active, patient predator waiting for you to make the next move. I tried to pull my hands away. I threw my weight backward, attempting to tear my grip from the sodden wool of the stranger's coat and stumble away from the stainless steel table. I couldn't move. The dead man's thick, swollen fingers had lashed around my right wrist with a grip like an industrial hydraulic clamp, cold, unyielding, and impossible to pry open. The skin of his hand felt like frozen river ice, sending sharp, agonizing needle pricks of frost up through my forearm and straight into my shoulder. Slowly, with a terrifying, mechanical smoothness, the heavy head turned upward on its stiff neck. The eyelids peeled back. Think about how much security we derive from our routines, believing that our daily labor, sorting papers, driving trucks, nailing lids onto wooden boxes, keeps us safely separated from the macabre reality of the world. We tell ourselves that as long as we follow the rules, handle our tasks with professional detachment, and keep our heads down in the dark, the dead will stay dead. We treat human remains like raw materials in a factory, turning off our empathy and treating our shift work as nothing more than a mechanical transaction between the living and the gone. Then a pair of wide, unblinking eyes snaps open beneath the flickering neon lights and locks onto yours with intelligent, freezing malice, and you realize your entire life has been built over a mass grave of things that never truly rested. The stranger's eyes had no warmth in them, no human confusion, no lingering spark of memory, and no sign of the river's chill. They were pale, milky gray, reflecting the buzzing green light of the ceiling tube like twin pools of stagnant water. And then, deep within the basement around us, a sudden, violent reaction began. Asterisk thud. Thud. Thud 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 asterisk. It started with the nearest shipping crate, a heavy pine box stacked against the northern wall, containing the elderly woman we had processed earlier that afternoon. Something inside the box struck the wood with the force of a booted foot. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to move them, to grip an object, or to reach out and touch someone you love in the warmth of a secure room. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if every box in the room began to pound from the inside at the exact same moment? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. Across the dark basement, the muffled, frantic thumping spread from crate to crate like a contagion, dozens of dead hands striking the pine lids at once, demanding that I drop my tools and come down to unfasten their iron latches. The rhythmic, deafening pounding echoed through the subterranean basement like a battery of sledgehammers striking hollow iron drums. Asterisk thud. Thud. Thud 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 asterisk. The sound did not come from just one corner anymore. It rippled in a cascading wave across the entire 50-foot chamber, vibrating through the damp concrete floor and rattling the brass instruments hanging from the supply shelves. My wrist remained locked in the iron grip of the massive stranger on the zinc table, his milky gray eyes staring straight through my face as if I were nothing more than a shadow cast against the wall. Have you ever experienced that complete, catastrophic collapse of reality where every rule you thought governed the universe shatters into dust in less than a single heartbeat? People always talk about panic as a sudden rush of adrenaline that sharpens your senses, giving you the clarity to fight your way out of a tight spot or sprint for the exit. They imagine they would grab a weapon, kick open the heavy oak doors, and run screaming up the concrete stairs into the rainy safety of Manhattan streets. They do not know the blinding, suffocating paralysis of being trapped 50 feet underground while an entire warehouse of dead men starts beating on their shipping crates from the inside. They do not know what it feels like when your knees turn to water, your chest seizes up, and your brain simply refuses to process the impossible nightmare unfolding all around you. With my left hand, I scrambled frantically across the zinc surface of the prep table, my fingers slipping in the mixture of melting ice and formalin until they brushed against the heavy, wooden-handled mallet I used to drive the iron spikes. I curled my fingers around the tool, lifted it high above my shoulder, and brought it down with all my strength directly across the back of the stranger's wrist where his fingers clamped onto my arm. Thwack! The thick hickory handle struck bone with a dull, hollow thud that reverberated up my forearm. The stranger's grip did not loosen by a millimeter. His frozen fingers remained sunk into my flesh like iron spikes driven into oak, and the milky gray eyes didn't even blink under the impact. Instead, the stranger's jaw split wider, parting in a dry, tearing sound as a low, rattling exhale hissed from his throat, smelling of river mud and 50 years of stagnant darkness. Think about how much faith we place in the flimsy wooden barriers we build to keep the chaos of mortality tucked neatly out of sight. We nail 3/4-inch pine planks together, drive a few galvanized nails into the corners, stamp a shipping number on the side in black grease ink, and convince ourselves we have successfully managed the problem of human decay. We believe that once a body is boxed and labeled, it belongs to the logistics of the city, safely bound by the laws of gravity, commerce, and time. Then the boxes start hitting back from the inside, and you realize that every crate in your basement is not a container for the dead, but an incubator for something the earth refused to digest. Around the room, the pounding grew frantic. A vertical stack of 3 heavy shipping crates near the east wall shuddered violently, the topmost box shifting sideways as splintered wood began to burst outward under the force of a sudden, violent blow from within. Creak, snap. A long, gray-skinned arm, stripped of its sleeve and caked in dried embalming fluid, thrust itself through the fractured side of the pine box, its fingers clawing wildly at the damp air of the basement as if searching for a throat to squeeze. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, metallic taste of fear flooding my mouth as I realized the wooden latches across the room were beginning to pop open one by one. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady pulse of life, and the quiet comfort of an ordinary evening. How long do you think those fingers would hold on to their courage if every box around you started breaking its seams in the dark? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. The stranger on the table pulled my arm an inch closer to his chest, his freezing lips parting as he prepared to speak his first word into the buzzing green light of the basement. The rattling exhale died away in the stranger's throat, replaced by a sound so dry and grating it sounded like coarse gravel sliding across a sheet of rusted sheet metal. His massive jaw shifted sideways with a sickening pop, the tight skin stretching to its absolute limit as a voice formed in the space between us, not vibrating through the air, but echoing directly inside my own skull. Asterisk, you forgot to stamp the manifest. Asterisk. Have you ever experienced that complete, soul-crushing realization that your most trivial daily routines have somehow bound you to forces far beyond your comprehension? People always talk about paperwork, stamps, and shipping manifests as the harmless, boring bureaucracy of modern life, meaningless ink on cheap paper designed to keep corporate offices happy and assembly lines moving. They imagine that missing a signature or failing to stamp a form is just an administrative error that results in a delayed shipment or a scolding from a grumpy supervisor in the morning. They do not know the terrifying reality of standing in a subterranean morgue while a corpse reminds you of an uncompleted clerical duty with the authority of an executioner. They do not know what it feels like when the bureaucratic machinery of the city turns out to be an occult ledger managed by things that live beneath the riverbed. My knees shook violently, the heavy work boots sliding in the mixture of melting ice and blood pooling beneath the zinc table. With my free left hand, still gripping the heavy wooden mallet, I struck the stranger's shoulder again and again, hammering desperately at the frozen gray flesh until the wood splintered into jagged splinters. He didn't even flinch. His milky gray eyes remained locked onto mine, unblinking and dead, yet burning with an intelligence that reached straight down into the darkest corners of my past. He knew my name. He knew why I had fled upstate 2 years ago, why I took the night shift where nobody could look me in the eye, and why I spent my life nailing pine boards over things the world wanted to forget. Think about how carefully we curate the narratives of our own innocence, convincing ourselves that we are merely good people caught in bad circumstances, doing honest work to survive. We check our boxes, we punch our time cards, we sign our names at the bottom of the page, and we tell ourselves that our hands are clean because we followed the instructions given to us by men in suits. We believe that our labor is separate from our souls, that a job is just a job as long as the paycheck clears at the end of the week. Then a dead man sits up on your prep table, points out a missing stamp on your manifest, and shows you that every document you ever processed was actually a deed of ownership signed in your own blood. Across the basement, the splintering wood of the surrounding shipping crates reached a deafening crescendo. Asterisk crack. Splinter. Crash, asterisk. The lid of the nearest crate burst upward in a shower of sawdust and rusted iron nails, and a second pale, waterlogged hand reached out into the green neon light, gripping the edge of the shelf and pulling itself up into the open air of the room. The basement was coming apart at the seams. The boxes we had packed, nailed, and stacked throughout the week were emptying themselves onto the concrete floor, one by one, filling the narrow aisles with the heavy, rotting stench of the Hudson River. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep working your routine if you realized that every form you filled out was bringing the dead one step closer to your door? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. The stranger on the table released my wrist so suddenly that I stumbled backward into the supply shelves, sending a cascade of glass bottles and stainless steel trays crashing down into the rising water at my feet. The cascade of glass bottles and stainless steel trays hit the concrete floor with a deafening, metallic crash that shattered the damp air of the basement into 1,000 jagged echoes. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my boots slipping frantically in the mixture of broken glass, chemical runoff, and rising gray water that had begun to back up from the floor drains. Have you ever experienced that overwhelming, instinctual panic when you realize that backing away from a horror only traps you deeper inside its architecture? People always talk about escape as a linear motion, a simple matter of turning your back on danger, finding an exit, and running until the open air fills your lungs with safety. They imagine that doors are meant to open, that stairs lead up to the street, and that a locked building can always be breached if you push hard enough against the panic bars. They do not know the claustrophobic nightmare of working in a subterranean basement where the exits are sealed from the outside and the rising water smells less like rain and more like the deep, stagnant silt of an underground river. They do not know what it feels like when the floor beneath you turns into a mudflat and the walls begin to sweat black grease. I pushed myself up against the western wall, my back pressing hard against the cold, damp concrete blocks as I watched the massive stranger rise fully to his feet on the zinc prep table. He towered above the room, his water-soaked wool coat dripping a thick, dark sludge that hissed whenever it touched the bare metal of the table. Around him, the basement was no longer a mortuary. It was a reclamation yard. Out of the fractured shipping crates, more figures were hauling themselves onto the floor, dozens of them, all pale, all soaked in river brine, and all moving with the jerky, unyielding synchronization of clockwork dolls driven by a broken spring. They didn't look at each other. Their milky gray eyes were fixed entirely on me, tracking my every breath like hounds picking up a scent in a dead forest. Think about how foolishly we rely on the structures of the modern city to shield us from the primordial chaos that hums just beneath the pavement. We walk down Fifth Avenue beneath towering glass skyscrapers, riding subways that roar through pitch-black tunnels, and we convince ourselves that we have conquered the earth, turning every square inch of nature into a ledger of our own design. We believe that concrete, steel, and municipal ordinances have permanently caged the wild, dark things that walked the earth before the first stone was ever laid. Then a Friday night storm floods the sub-basement of a Manhattan funeral home, and you realize that New York was never a city at all, it was just a thin crust of asphalt built over a very deep, very patient swamp. The massive stranger took a slow, heavy step off the edge of the prep table, his bare feet slapping against the wet concrete with the sound of heavy timber hitting mud. Asterisk slap. Slap, asterisk. He began to walk down the narrow aisle between the stacked crates, his massive shoulders brushing against the brass supply shelves and sending rusted scalpels and bone saws clattering to the floor. The other figures parted to let him pass, their dead hands twitching at their sides, their swollen jaws hanging open in silent, synchronized harmony. I reached blindly behind my back, my fingers clawing along the damp concrete wall until they struck the heavy iron fire alarm lever housed in its red metal box near the freight chute. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep your secrets if the walls started closing in and the floor began to fill with the tide of everything you tried to bury? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. I gripped the iron handle of the alarm box, yanked it downward with all the remaining strength in my body, and waited for the piercing shriek of the bells to summon the world outside to my rescue. The heavy iron handle of the alarm box came all the way down with a dull, hollow clank that echoed against the damp concrete blocks of the basement wall. I stood there, my fingers still hooked around the cold red metal, waiting for the piercing, metallic shriek of the emergency bells to tear through the subterranean silence and summon the police, the fire department, or at least a night watchman from the street above. Nothing happened. The wires inside the box were dead. Not a single spark jumped, not a single bell chimed, and the old neon tube above my head merely gave another sickly, green flicker before dimming down to a faint, bruised glow that barely reached the edges of the room. Have you ever experienced that profound, sickening vertigo when you reach for a lifeline, a button, a switch, a phone, a voice, and discover that the entire mechanism was disconnected long before you ever walked into the room? People always talk about emergencies as moments of action, where calling for help is a guaranteed reflex that brings sirens wailing down the asphalt to pull you out of the fire. They imagine that society has a net spread beneath its streets, and that no matter how deep you fall, someone is always listening at the switchboard. They do not know the utter, crushing isolation of a basement where the wires have been chewed through by things that live in the foundations. They do not know what it feels like when you realize you aren't part of a bustling metropolis at all, but trapped in an airtight box at the bottom of a forgotten well. The massive stranger stopped midway down the aisle, his tall, waterlogged frame blocking the only clear path toward the freight elevator and the stairs leading up to the street. The dozens of pale, river-soaked figures fan out silently behind him, their heavy work boots standing ankle-deep in the gray water that now covered the concrete floor from wall to wall. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of rotting reeds, cold mud, and industrial formalin, making every breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. The stranger raised one massive hand, pointing a thick, swollen finger directly at the dead alarm box still clutched in my fist. And from deep within his chest, that grating, gravel-like voice scraped against my skull once more. Asterisk, there are no outside lines in the ledger. Asterisk. Think about how much trust we place in our connections, our telephone wires, our radio signals, our mailing addresses, and our digital profiles, believing they keep us securely tethered to human civilization. We walk through life assuming that distance is measurable, that help is only a call away, and that our voices can always pierce the dark if we just shout loud enough. We forget that every communication line is strung across an abyss, and that the men who maintain the infrastructure are just temporary labor keeping the lines clear for things that don't use words. Then the wires go dead, the bells refuse to ring, and you find yourself standing alone in a room full of corpses that know your name better than you do. I let go of the iron handle, my hand slipping down the red metal box as I backed away until the small of my back hit the locked doors of the freight chute. The water was rising faster now, swirling around my ankles with a cold, greasy current that carried small bits of sawdust, packing straw, and old shipping labels in its wake. The stranger took another slow step forward, his milky gray eyes fixed on mine with an expression of absolute, bureaucratic inevitability, as if he were simply a supervisor coming to inspect an overdue shipment. The other figures moved with him, their arms hanging slack at their sides, their swollen fingers twitching in unison with the rhythmic dripping of water from the ceiling pipes. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep typing or writing if the telephone suddenly went dead and every door in the building locked itself from the outside? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. The massive leader reached out and laid his heavy, freezing hand directly upon my shoulder, pressing me down into the rising water as the freight chute behind me slowly began to unlatch itself. The heavy iron latches of the freight chute snapped upward with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, and the thick, freezing draft that poured through the opening smelled no longer of New York asphalt, but of raw, open river water surging through a subterranean storm drain. The massive stranger's hand pressed down on my shoulder with the unyielding weight of a hydraulic press, forcing me backward into the dark, vertical shaft where the old municipal lift cables hung like slack spider webs. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, weightless horror when the floor disappears beneath your boots and you realize you are being dropped backward into a space you spent your entire life trying to avoid? People always talk about falling as an accident, a sudden trip, a momentary loss of balance, or a structural failure that catches a person unawares in the middle of their day. They imagine scrambling for a handhold, catching a ledge, or falling into a net of safety before the worst can happen. They do not know the deliberate, systematic cruelty of being lowered into the dark by something that has checked your name off a manifest and determined exactly which bin you belong in. They do not know what it feels like when your heels slide over the edge of a concrete ledge and the only thing supporting your weight is a dead man's fingers digging into your collarbone. I twisted violently, my boots kicking out into the rising gray water as I tried to wrench my shoulder free from the stranger's grip. My knuckles scraped against the rusted iron wall of the chute, tearing the skin and leaving bright smears of crimson across the metal plates, though the blood that ran from the cuts didn't drip red for long before turning that same greasy, iridescent black. Below us, in the pitch-black depths of the shaft, the sound of rushing water was deafening. It was the roar of the Hudson, backing up through the old industrial drainage tunnels, carrying thousands of tons of silt, drowned debris, and forgotten history straight toward the basement foundations of the mortuary. Think about how carefully we build our cities over the top of the earth, burying our rivers in concrete culvert pipes, covering our waste in landfills, and pretending that what we wash down the drain is gone forever. We walk along the waterfront parks and watch the container ships glide smoothly across the gray harbor, convinced that the modern world has mastered the currents of nature. We believe that our filth stays down, that our secrets stay buried, and that the river only takes what we willingly give it. Then the basement doors open to the tide, and you realize that every drop of water running beneath the asphalt is connected to a ledger that never forgets a single item dropped into its depths. The stranger leaned forward, bringing his bloated, gray-skinned face inches from mine as the cold spray from the chute drenched our clothes. His milky eyes didn't blink. His chest didn't rise. And from deep within his hollow throat came that dry, scraping whisper, echoing off the iron walls of the shaft like a judge reading a final sentence. Asterisk, the shipment is complete. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep their grip if the floor gave way and the dark water reached up to pull you under? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. With a single, effortless shove, the massive stranger let go of my shoulder, and I dropped backward into the roaring blackness of the chute, feeling the cold river water rush up to swallow me whole. The descent through the freight chute was not a clean fall through open air, it was a violent, bruising slide down an iron-lined drainpipe that scraped the skin from my arms and slammed my shoulders against rusted rivet heads in the absolute dark. Ice-cold river water rushed down beside me in a torrential wave, carrying the heavy stench of damp silt, rusted iron, and decades of urban decay straight into the subterranean depths of Manhattan. Have you ever experienced that suffocating, disorienting panic when you realize you are being washed away through a network of forgotten tunnels beneath the city, with no idea where the drainage pipe ends or what is waiting at the bottom? People always talk about water as a cleansing, life-giving force, something that washes away the dirt of the day, fills our reservoirs, and keeps the green parks and bustling harbors alive. They imagine gentle rivers, sparkling lakes, and rain falling softly against the glass of a warm, secure room on a quiet afternoon. They do not know the terrifying, industrial weight of a subterranean flood rushing through concrete culverts built 100 years ago by men who never meant to see the light of day again. They do not know what it feels like when the water turns thick with mud and debris, wrapping around your limbs like cold, heavy fingers pulling you down into the dark. My back struck the curved concrete wall of the tunnel with a dull thud that knocked the remaining breath from my lungs, spinning me sideways into a swirling eddy of freezing silt and floating wooden splinters. I surfaced coughing and gasping, my hands clawing wildly at the slick, moss-covered brick archway above my head while the current tried to drag my legs deeper into the black pipe. The air down here was thick and dead, tainted by the chemical tang of old formalin and the sour smell of rotting river reeds. In the faint, greenish phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the water itself, I could see the vast network of brick tunnels stretching out in every direction beneath the city streets, an underground labyrinth where the municipal sewer lines intersected with the forgotten cargo vaults of the harbor. Think about how arrogantly we move across the surface of the earth, walking over thousands of miles of subterranean darkness without ever giving a thought to what lies just beneath our shoe soles. We ride the subway cars, We drive our cars across the bridges, and we build our massive stone foundations deep into the ground, convinced that our civilization is safely anchored to solid rock. We forget that every great city is built over a hollow network of drainage pipes, abandoned crypts, and forgotten rivers that have been forced underground to make room for our commerce. Then a storm swells the harbor, the basement doors give way, and you find yourself swept down into the catacombs where the city stores everything it couldn't bring itself to burn. I forced my aching legs to find purchase against the slippery brick floor of the tunnel, fighting against the relentless push of the gray current as I dragged myself up onto a narrow concrete ledge running alongside the drainage pipe. My work clothes were shredded, soaked through with river silt and stained with that iridescent black fluid that had replaced my blood. Every muscle in my body throbbed with a dull, freezing ache, and my right hand was still stained permanent black from the stamping pads back at the mortuary. Down the main tunnel, echoing off the curved brick walls with rhythmic precision, the sound began again. Clank screech, clank screech. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep pushing forward if you had to crawl through a flooded utility tunnel with no map and no way back to the surface? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. Emerging from the pitch-black junction ahead, dragging a massive iron-shod cargo crate by a thick steel tow cable, a long line of pale, waterlogged figures appeared in the greenish gloom, marching in silent synchronization toward the open harbor. The low, metallic screech of iron-shod wheels grinding against wet, uneven brick echoed down the subterranean utility tunnel like the hull of an old freighter scraping across a hidden river reef. I pressed my back hard against the damp, moss-covered brick archway of the ledge, my boots sinking into the greasy silt as the massive procession of river-soaked figures drew closer in the dim, greenish phosphorescence. Have you ever experienced that creeping, bone-deep certainty that the nightmare you just fell into is not an accident of the storm, but an ancient, industrial assembly line that has been running beneath the city for centuries? People always talk about escaping danger as a race toward freedom, a frantic dash up a flight of stairs or a desperate swim toward the surface where the air is clean and the lights of the metropolis are burning bright. They imagine that once you get away from the immediate threat, the normal rules of the world instantly take over again, offering safety, warmth, and a second chance. They do not know the soul-crushing reality of discovering that the underground labyrinth is not just a drainage system, but a vast, underground sorting plant where the city's lost inventory is permanently put back to work. They do not know what it feels like when you realize there is no surface left to climb back to, because the city above you is just another layer of the same machine. The leading figure in the procession was the massive stranger from the prep table, the one who had shoved me down the freight chute. He did not look at me as he passed. His swollen, gray-skinned hands were lashed to a thick steel tow cable that ran back to a towering, skeletal wooden crate mounted on heavy iron wheels, a crate identical to the one stacked in the basement of the mortuary, except this one was twice the size and leaking a thick, black trail of stagnant river mud from its base. Behind him marched dozens of others, their clothes shredded and soaked, their milky eyes fixed straight ahead in a dead, unblinking trance, hauling cargo through the pitch-black tunnels without a single word of complaint or a moment of rest. Think about how proudly we celebrate our industrial progress, building towering skyscrapers, vast transit networks, and sprawling commercial warehouses to store and move the endless products of our modern civilization. We write our shipping manifests, we stamp our logbooks, and we manage our supply chains with ruthless efficiency, convinced that our commerce is the ultimate expression of human ambition. We believe that once a product is shipped, a document is filed, and a worker clocks out, the transaction is complete and the ledger can be closed for the day. Then you find yourself trapped in the sub-basement of the city's infrastructure, watching an endless line of dead men haul iron crates through the sewer lines, and you realize that every item ever shipped in New York was just a down payment on a debt collected in the dark. As the last wooden crate rumbled past me, kicking up clouds of foul-smelling sediment from the floor of the tunnel, the massive leader suddenly stopped. The entire line behind him ground to a halt with a deafening screech of iron and steel. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the brick ceiling far above. The leader slowly turned his heavy, waterlogged head on its stiff neck and looked back over his shoulder directly at me. And from deep within his chest, that grating, gravel-like voice scraped against my skull once more. Asterisk, your shift is not finished. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep moving if you were handed a tow cable and told to take your place at the end of the line? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. Before I could back away, the stranger reached out with a thick, freezing hand, grabbed me by the collar of my torn work shirt, and yanked me off the ledge straight down into the freezing mud beside the heavy iron wheels. The thick steel tow cable hit the wet brick floor with a heavy, shivering clang that sent vibrations straight up through the soles of my boots and into the marrow of my bones. I struggled in the freezing mud, my fingers clawing desperately at the slippery slime as I tried to wrench myself away from the massive stranger who held me by the collar with the unyielding strength of an industrial hoist. Have you ever experienced that complete, paralyzing despair of realizing that your resistance is nothing more than a minor administrative delay in a process that cannot be stopped? People always talk about fighting for your life as a heroic struggle, a moment where sheer willpower, adrenaline, and a refusal to give up can break you free from any trap and carry you back to the sunlight. They imagine that as long as you keep kicking, screaming, and fighting against your captors, the universe will eventually intervene on your behalf. They do not know the crushing, soul-draining reality of standing in an underground tunnel where the rules are written by things that have been dead for a century. They do not know what it feels like when your frantic struggles are met only with the patient, indifferent silence of an overseer waiting for you to get back to work. The massive stranger did not strike me. He didn't need to. With a single, effortless motion of his swollen arm, he shoved me forward against the heavy iron-shod axle of the cargo crate, pressing my chest directly against the icy wire cable that fed into the front of the wooden housing. A pair of rusted iron clamps, open and waiting like the jaws of a steel trap, hung from the end of the cable directly above my hands. The grating, gravel-like voice echoed once more inside my skull, devoid of anger, full of bureaucratic finality. Asterisk, strap in. The manifest requires two. Asterisk. Think about how blindly we accept the burdens handed down to us by the systems we serve, taking on extra shifts, heavier workloads, and impossible quotas because we are told it is simply part of the job. We tell ourselves that if we just work hard enough, stay late enough, and keep our heads down, we will eventually earn our freedom and leave the factory behind for good. We believe that our labor belongs to us, that our time is our own to spend once the clock hits 5 and the doors are unlocked. Then you find yourself chained to a cargo cable in a flooded sewer beneath Manhattan, and you realize that the company never lets its workers retire, it only promotes them to heavier loads. The stranger's freezing fingers wrapped around my right wrist, forcing my hand up against the cold iron clamps while the thick wire bit mercilessly into my skin, drawing another slow trickle of that iridescent black fluid. Across the aisle, the dozens of pale, waterlogged figures stood motionless in the greenish phosphorescence, their milky eyes watching the transaction with a dull, synchronized patience. Behind me, the dark expanse of the utility tunnel stretched endlessly into the subterranean gloom, filled with the faint, rhythmic sound of 1,000 other cables dragging through the silt. I looked down at my right palm, where the permanent black ink from the mortuary stamp pad had begun to mix with the black blood pouring from my wrist, spelling out a single word across my skin: processed. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep your secrets if the iron clamps snapped shut around your wrists and the signal was given to pull the load? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. With a sharp, metallic snap, the iron clamps locked around my wrists, anchoring me permanently to the tow cable as the massive leader turned back toward the dark harbor and shouted the single word that set the entire subterranean fleet back into motion. The heavy iron clamps locked around my wrists with a sharp, echoing snap that sent a numbing shock of frost up through my forearms, permanently anchoring my skin to the cold steel of the tow cable. The massive leader raised his rusted iron hook, bringing it down against the brick floor with a hollow clank that signaled the resumption of the midnight march. Have you ever wondered what remains of a man when the last trace of his old life is stripped away and he becomes just another anonymous piece of infrastructure in the deep, dark machinery of the world? People always talk about the end of a story as a moment of finality, a dramatic climax where the hero either wins his freedom, defeats the monster, or makes a noble sacrifice that leaves his memory shining brightly in the hearts of those who remain behind. They imagine that even in tragedy, there is a sense of closure, an ending that makes the struggle worthwhile. They do not know the hollow, soul-numbing reality of a shift that never ends, a routine that continues long after your name has faded from every directory on the surface. They do not know what it feels like when the dawn finally breaks 300 feet above your head, and you realize you aren't coming back up to see it. The heavy wooden crate lurched forward behind me, its iron-shod wheels grinding against the wet brick floor as the dead weight of the cargo settled into the harness against my chest. My boots found no purchase in the slick, freezing silt, but my legs moved anyway, driven by the relentless mechanical pull of the tow cable and the silent, unyielding pressure of the hundreds of figures marching behind me in the gloom. We moved deeper into the labyrinth of flooded utility tunnels, leaving the dim phosphorescence of the Manhattan sub-basement far behind, heading toward the vast, black subterranean harbor where the river meets the sea. My hands burned with the cold, the black ink from the stamp pads mixing with the dark fluid dripping from my wrists until my skin was entirely coated in a shimmering, iridescent armor of permanent ink. Think about how carefully we curate the illusion of our own independence, stacking up our daily routines, our jobs, and our ambitions like boxes on a shelf, convinced that we are the ones steering our course through life. We write our names on manifests, we punch our time clocks, and we tell ourselves that our labor is an investment in a future we control. We forget that every system we serve is an ancient, hungry machine designed to consume our time, our energy, and our names until nothing is left to log. Then you find yourself chained to a heavy iron cable in the dark, pulling a box you didn't pack toward a shore you can't see, and you realize that the ledger was never yours to write in the first place. Up ahead, through the mist-choked arch of the final drainage gate, the black, open water of the Hudson stretched out under a sky of impenetrable iron clouds, where the distant, muffled sirens of the sleeping city above sounded like the cries of seabirds fading across an empty ocean. The massive leader stopped at the water's edge, unhooking his heavy iron chain and turning back to face the endless line of workers staggering through the mud. He looked directly at me with his milky gray eyes, lifted a heavy wooden stamp and a black ink pad from his belt, and pressed the pad against my forehead with a cold, firm pressure. Asterisk click. Stamp asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by iron and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving before the ledger claims your page and the night supervisor assigns your box to the next man in line? We are all just temporary workers moving heavy boxes in the dark while the city sleeps above our heads. And as the heavy iron gates swung open to let our cargo slide silently out into the black, freezing current of the river, I gripped the tow cable with both hands, planted my boots in the silt, and took my permanent place at the head of the line.